If you look at the political map of Europe today versus, say, 20 years ago, it's almost unrecognizable. There's been a massive shift. So today, we're going to dig into the data and the analysis behind one of the biggest political stories of our time, the incredible rise of populism.
First things first, let's just look at the symptom itself. And we're not talking about a minor political tremor here. No, this is a full-on shockwave. It has fundamentally transformed how power works across the entire continent. And this whole transformation really starts with one frankly staggering number. Right now, 1 out of every 4 votes cast in Europe goes to a populist party. Just let that sink in for a minute. This is not some fringe movement anymore. It's mainstream.
And what's really fascinating is that this didn't just happen overnight. Look at this chart. If you rewind to 1998, populist parties were only getting about 7% of the vote. Fast forward 2 decades, and that number has more than tripled to over 25%. It has been a slow, steady, and absolutely relentless climb.
Okay, so to really get what's going on, we have to be clear on what we're actually talking about. We need a proper diagnosis, and that means we need to define our terms. What exactly is populism? Well, when you boil it all down, populism is basically an idea that splits the world into 2 groups. On one side, you have the good, honest, ordinary people. And on the other, you have a corrupt, out-of-touch elite. And the core argument is that politics should just be a pure expression of what the people want, period.
So the big question is, why is that message hitting home for so many millions of people? I mean, a political shift this huge doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? So let's get into the diagnosis and see what's really fueling this political fire.
And this really gets to the heart of it. A lot of critics will say that populists are just exploiting people's fears. But the other side of that coin is that they are tapping into something very, very real. They're giving a voice to people who are facing genuine, tough, everyday problems. And we're not talking about abstract economic theories here. These are the real-life hardships. It's the fact that you can't afford a decent place to live. It's wages that haven't gone up in years. It's the constant fear of losing your job. It's watching the gap between the rich and everyone else just get wider and wider. And, maybe most importantly, it's this deep, powerful feeling of being completely let down by the people in charge. Okay, so if those are the causes, what's the cure? What's the treatment plan? Well, the sources we're looking at suggest it's not about trying to fight populism with slogans. It's about a total, radical rethink of how politics is done. And the very first step in this prescription, it's a big dose of honesty. The argument is that mainstream leaders have got to stop sugarcoating things. They need to come clean with voters about the enormous, deep-seated challenges that Europe is really up against.
And the scale of these challenges is just immense. Just take demographics. By the middle of this century, the number of working, tax-paying people in the EU is expected to drop by a jaw-dropping 50 million people. Think about what that means for funding everything. Pensions, healthcare, you name it.
And here's the kicker. At the exact same time the tax base is shrinking, the bills are piling up like never before. We're talking about massive new spending needed for defense, for the skyrocketing healthcare costs of an aging population, and for a complete overhaul of our infrastructure to deal with climate change. So this all leads to a very clear fork in the road. 2 completely different visions for the future. One path is the populist approach. Go it alone, put up walls, and reject cross-border solutions. The other path is the complete opposite. Work together with deeper EU-level cooperation and big, coordinated reforms to face these crises as a team. And that brings us to the final prognosis. When you look at all the analysis, it's pretty clear. Europe is standing at a major crossroads, and which path it takes is going to come down to one thing: political will. So, the real takeaway from all this is that simply pointing fingers and labeling opponents as populists, well, that strategy has been tried, and it just hasn't worked. The only way forward, it seems, is to actually acknowledge the real problems that fuel this movement and then tackle them head-on with policies that are bold, honest, and Europe-wide.
Which, of course, leaves us with the massive question hanging over the entire continent. Will mainstream parties find the courage to make these kinds of radical changes, or will the populist wave just keep getting bigger? The diagnosis has been made, the prescription has been written. But whether Europe is willing to take the medicine, well, that is the multi-trillion-euro question that's going to define the next generation.
So if we look back to 1998, populist parties held a really tiny fraction of the vote across Europe. I think it was something like a mere 7%.
Yeah, exactly 7%, just a fringe element.
Right. But today, I mean, the numbers are wild. Today, 1 in 4 votes cast across the continent goes to a populist party.
It's a massive shift.
It really is. The pendulum hasn't just swung, it's like the clock is completely broken. We are looking at a political landscape that has been totally upended in the span of a single generation. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Because whether you are prepping for a political science seminar, or maybe just trying to make sense of the daily news alerts buzzing on your phone, or even wondering why political debates at the dinner table feel so much more intense these days, this topic directly affects the reality you live in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is the defining political story of our time. They have more than tripled their support. They've secured enough votes to put their leaders into government posts in at least 11 countries in recent years. We are witnessing a fundamental rewiring of the European electorate.
And we are tackling this with a very specific mission today. We want to take a wide-angle, historically grounded, and, politically nuanced look into this phenomenon.
Right, because it requires nuance.
Exactly. This isn't about taking political sides. We are not here to cheerlead for populist movements, and we aren't here to condemn them either. Our goal today is just an impartial, intellectually rigorous analysis of the underlying drivers.
We have to treat the rise of populism as a serious, multi-causal political reality, because it has profound implications for the entire world.
So to do that, we have synthesized a really massive stack of sources for you.
Yeah, we're pulling from a lot of great data. We've got comprehensive election tracking from The Guardian, looking at this 20-year surge.
Yeah.
We've also got deep sociological research from the EU-funded Fatigue Project.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It really is. They specifically examine the post-Cold War transitions in Central and Eastern Europe. And we're pairing that with incredibly detailed case studies from Cambridge University Press and the International Public Policy Association, looking at what happens when populists actually take power.
Plus, we are pulling from some really interesting Stanford University research on how these parties approach foreign policy and international alliances, like NATO.
And we can't forget the behavioral studies.
Right. The behavioral studies from the ICCT on the psychological and emotional engines driving these movements. And some policy analysis from groups like Friends of Europe and IMED.
And the reason all of this matters to you, listening right now, is that populism is no longer just a fringe movement yelling from the sidelines.
No, they're in the building.
Exactly. They are actively reshaping the European Union. They are testing the resilience of international military alliances. And maybe most importantly, they are fundamentally challenging the very concept of liberal democracy.
Because this isn't just a dispute over, tax rates or highway funding.
No, not at all. It is about deep structural tensions. We're talking about national sovereignty versus supranational governance, cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, urban elites versus rural populations.
It's the clash between technocratic management and democratic legitimacy.
Exactly. So before we can diagnose why Europe is changing so rapidly, I think we have to accurately define what exactly is growing.
Let's do that. Because, let's be honest, the word populist gets thrown around on the news constantly.
That's all the time.
It's basically become a catch-all insult for any politician that a commentator just happens to disagree with.
Right. It loses all its meaning. But our sources are very rigorous about defining this. They rely heavily on the ideational approach.
An ideational approach.
Yeah, which was most famously articulated by the political scientist Cass Munn. Under this framework, populism is not an economic policy. It's not a personality type, and it's not a specific rhetorical style.
Okay, so what is it?
It is defined as a thin-centered ideology.
A thin-centered ideology. Okay, I like to think of this with a biological analogy. Let's think of populism like a vine.
A vine, right?
Yeah, because a vine can't really stand up on its own. It doesn't have the structural integrity to form a freestanding tree. It needs a trellis, a pre-existing structure to wrap itself around and grow.
I love that analogy.
So if populism is structurally thin, it needs a thick host ideology to attach to, right? To offer a full political program.
That perfectly captures the mechanics of it. The core of that thin vine is what political scientists call a Manichaean worldview.
Okay, let's pause and unpack Manichaean, because that's a pretty heavy academic term. Manichaeism was actually an ancient religion, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
And it viewed the entire universe as a strict, uncompromising battle between absolute light and absolute darkness. Like, there are absolutely no shades of gray.
And that ancient religious absolutism is exactly why the term is used in political science here. The populist vine divides society into two homogeneous, completely unnuanced, and inherently antagonistic camps.
So it's an us versus them setup.
Completely. On one side, you have the pure people. On the other side, you have the corrupt elite. And populism insists that politics should just be the direct, unfiltered expression of the general will of those pure people.
But because the ideology is thin, like my vine analogy.
Exactly. Because it's thin, it doesn't have answers for complex policy questions. It doesn't tell you what the marginal tax rate should be or how to handle healthcare administration.
So it needs that thick host ideology to give it specific direction.
Right. And this is exactly how we differentiate between left-wing and right-wing populism across Europe.
Let's break that down for the listener. Because, I mean, a populist in France might look entirely different from a populist in Greece. How does this vine grow on the right side of the political spectrum versus the left?
Well, the divergence hinges entirely on how a specific movement defines the people and the elite.
Okay.
Let's look at right-wing populism. Think of parties like Fidesz in Hungary, the National Rally in France, or the AfD in Germany. They use an exclusive nativist definition of the people.
Nativist meaning based on where you were born?
Exactly. They define the pure people based on ethnicity, nationality, or traditional cultural heritage. Therefore, their thick host ideology, their trellis, is nationalism.
So they wrap the populist vine around a nationalist trellis.
Precisely. Their political program focuses heavily on cultural security, strict law and order, and fierce anti-immigration policies.
Because immigration threatens that nativist definition.
Right. In their Manichaean worldview, the corrupt elite consists of cosmopolitan politicians, liberal academics, and international bureaucrats in Brussels. They argue these elites are actively allowing the nation's traditional identity to be diluted by outsiders or, globalist forces.
So for them, the defining issue is the border, both the physical border and the cultural border.
Yes, exactly. But then you look at left-wing populism, and it's a completely different trellis.
Right, because left-wing populism like Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, they use an inclusive socioeconomic definition of the people.
Yes. For them, the pure people are the hardworking working class, the economically marginalized, the ordinary citizens just struggling to pay rent or secure a pension.
So their thick host ideology is socialism, or at least a really fierce anti-neoliberalism.
Exactly. So their villain isn't the immigrant. Not at all. They frame the struggle as the ordinary citizen fighting against the neoliberal capitalist elite. The multinational bankers and the technocrats imposing crushing austerity measures.
They argue that the elites have rigged the economic system to siphon wealth upward, leaving the pure people destitute.
Right. So we have the right-wing vine wrapped around cultural nationalism and the left-wing vine wrapped around economic anti-capitalism.
But regardless of which side of the spectrum they sit on, both versions run into a massive fundamental wall when it comes to actually governing, don't they?
They do. The research calls this the pluralism problem.
The pluralism problem.
Yeah.
Let's dig into that because this seems like where populism directly challenges the bedrock of liberal democracy.
It absolutely is. Liberal democracy is fundamentally built on the concept of pluralism. Pluralism operates on the belief that society is inherently diverse. It is made up of different classes, religions, ethnicities, and geographic regions.
Which makes sense. No country is just one monolith.
Right. And crucially, pluralism assumes that all of these different groups have different but legitimate interests.
I always think about pluralism like a healthy, thriving ecosystem. You have different species, different groups all competing for resources, but they all have a legitimate right to exist in the forest.
That's a good way to look at it.
And because they all have a right to exist, the only way the ecosystem survives is through balance. In politics, that balance is compromise. It's checks and balances, the protection of minority rights, and just the understanding that nobody gets 100% of what they want.
Right. Compromise is the water that keeps the democratic ecosystem alive.
But the populist vine rejects that ecosystem entirely.
It has to. Because populism claims there's only a single homogeneous general will of the pure people. If you fundamentally believe that you, and only you, represent the absolute singular will of the good, pure citizens, then anyone who opposes your policies isn't just a political opponent with a different viewpoint.
They are an enemy of the people.
Exactly. They become part of the corrupt elite trying to subvert the nation.
That is a terrifying shift in political logic, Because if your opponent is an enemy of the people, you don't need to compromise with them. You need to defeat them.
Right. It creates what political scientists call a monist view, a single will. And this inherently clashes with pluralistic institutions.
So things like independent Supreme Courts or a free press.
Exactly. Institutions designed to build consensus or limit executive power, even an opposition party in parliament. Populists view these as illegitimate roadblocks.
To the populace, these aren't vital democratic safeguards. They are corrupt mechanisms constructed by the elite to thwart the will of the people.
That is exactly the framing. So if we understand what this vine looks like, the next logical question is, what kind of soil allowed it to grow so incredibly fast?
Yeah, because vines don't just spontaneously generate. They need fertile ground.
Let's look at the roots of resentment that prepared the European electorate for this message. We have to look at geography and history because the ground was prepared very differently in Eastern versus Western Europe.
Let's start with Central and Eastern Europe. I know we're looking at the research from the EU-funded Fatigue project here.
Yes, and they introduce a crucial, fascinating concept to explain the rise of majoritarian politics in places like Hungary and Poland. They call it delayed transformational fatigue.
Delayed transformational fatigue. I have to admit, that sounds like a medical condition you get after running an ultramarathon or something.
Well, it functions very much like a societal trauma. Think back to the monumental historical shift of the late 1980s and early 1990s.
The fall of the Berlin Wall.
Exactly. The collapse of the Soviet Union and state socialism brought about a rapid, massive transition. These countries had to democratize their political systems and liberalize their entire economies almost overnight.
It was essentially economic shock therapy. They were tearing down a state-run economy and trying to build a neoliberal free market while flying the plane.
That's a great way to put it. And while that transition eventually brought macroeconomic growth and integration with the West, the human cost on the ground was staggering. It created a pervasive sense of dislocation.
I can imagine.
Imagine being a factory worker or a mid-level manager whose entire life trajectory was guaranteed by the state. Suddenly you face massive income inequality, hyperinflation, and the privatization of public assets.
People must have felt completely shorn from their cultures.
They did. They felt disconnected from their individual identities by the rapid influx of Western globalization.
And the Fatigue Project specifically highlights that this caused a profound loss of status for previously advantaged groups. But the word delayed is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that concept, isn't it? Because we didn't see populists immediately take over Eastern Europe in 1993.
Right, that's the nuance of the research. Yeah. Initially, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there was a powerful elite consensus in these countries.
Everyone was on the same page.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The mainstream politicians across the spectrum agreed that integration with the West, joining the European Union, joining NATO, was the only viable path forward to secure their newly won independence from Russian influence.
So it seemed, to outside observers at least, that liberal democracy had fully consolidated.
It did. But underneath that macroeconomic success, the soil was turning toxic. The fatigue, the deep resentment over lost social status, the humiliation of being told their past lives were worthless, all of that was simmering.
Just waiting for a spark.
Exactly. By the 2010s, the initial euphoria joining the EU had worn off, and populists tapped directly into that delayed fatigue. They capitalized on it by promising to restore traditional hierarchies and social order.
Their message must have been incredibly potent, basically saying, the liberal transition robbed you of your dignity, it eroded our national sovereignty, and it enriched a new, corrupt elite. We will restore your status.
We will defend our Christian national identity against Western liberal overreach. That was the pitch.
So that is the soil in the East, the delayed trauma of the post-communist transition. But let's pan the camera over to the West, because we saw massive economic and social shocks in Western and Southern Europe as well, which prepared a totally different kind of fertile ground.
Absolutely. The broader European context was shaped heavily by the 2008 global financial crisis and the subsequent sovereign debt crises.
Which hit Southern Europe especially hard.
Very hard. The research highlights how discontent began to fundamentally poison European politics because the wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots widened dramatically.
The structural realities are grim. We are talking about severe austerity policies designed to save the euro, but which totally hollowed out public services.
Yeah, austerity was brutal.
We are talking about stagnant productivity and a generational crisis in housing. I read a stat that a third of Europeans tell pollsters they feel actively impoverished by housing costs alone.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
For a massive portion of the working and lower middle classes, the cost of living crisis wasn't just a temporary cyclical recession. It became their permanent reality.
Wow.
Younger workers faced intense job insecurity, navigating the gig economy or temporary contracts with low wages, knowing they would likely be poorer than their parents.
And all the while, as their local communities faced deindustrialization, they watched a relatively small, globally connected elite, often based in major capital cities, grow wealthier and more insulated from the economic shocks.
And that economic pain leads directly to the failure of the mainstream political institutions.
Right, because if you are a voter feeling that pressure, and you look at your traditional options, say the center-left Social Democrats or the center-right Christian Democrats, for a long time, they offered entirely different visions of the world.
But starting in the 1990s and really peaking in the 2000s, they started to look exactly the same.
This convergence of the mainstream is such a critical driver of the populist surge. Both sides basically accepted the tenets of globalization, European integration, and neoliberal economics as unquestionable, objective facts of life.
They completely stopped debating grand ideological visions. Instead, they just managed policies in a highly technocratic way. They were essentially just arguing over who could manage the free market more efficiently.
So to the struggling voter, it just looked like an elite consensus that offered absolutely no real alternatives to their economic pain.
Exactly. Think about it. If both the major parties agree that a factory has to close because of global market forces, who do you vote for to save your town?
The mainstream establishment became a massive stationary target for populists. A populist could just point at the parliament and say, look at them, they are all the same, they all go to the same schools, they all serve the same global markets, and absolutely none of them care about you.
It's a very compelling argument when you're hurting.
But I want to inject a layer of complexity here, though. If this is entirely about economic desperation, housing costs, the 2008 crash, deindustrialization, how do we explain the rise of populism in incredibly wealthy countries?
Yeah, right. Countries with robust social safety nets.
Yeah. We see right-wing populism surging in places like the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria, and across Scandinavia. These are some of the wealthiest, most equal societies on Earth. It's not just economic desperation driving this, is it?
No, it's not. The
Well-
sources confirm your suspicion.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not just about GDP growth or unemployment rates. In many wealthy nations, the driver is a deeper crisis of representation, identity, and cultural anxiety.
So it's about control.
It's about citizens feeling they have lost control over the destiny of their own societies.
Lost control to who, exactly?
To supranational entities,
Hmm.
primarily the European Union, and to unelected technocrats.
Right.
As European integration deepened over the last 3 decades, more and more decisions affecting daily life, things like trade regulations, environmental standards, migration quotas, were moved away from national parliaments in places like The Hague or Stockholm and sent over to the European Commission in Brussels.
And even if those decisions were economically beneficial on a macro level, they felt deeply undemocratic to the average citizen.
Exactly. The slogan, "Take Back Control," which drove the Brexit vote in the UK, wasn't just a British phenomenon. That sentiment resonated across the entire continent.
It exposes a deep tension between technocratic governance and democratic legitimacy. Technocratic governance is about doing what highly educated experts say is most efficient and rational for the system.
But democratic legitimacy is about doing what the people actually voted for, even if the experts think it's a terrible idea.
When those two forces collide, voters feel completely alienated. Furthermore, in these wealthy Western countries, there are intense tensions between multiculturalism and social cohesion, right?
Absolutely. Rapid immigration and demographic shifts created profound identity anxiety, especially among older or rural populations. They felt their traditional national culture was being eroded by cosmopolitan urban elites who favored open borders.
So we have this toxic, multi-layered cocktail. In the East, it's the delayed trauma of the post-communist transition and status loss. In the South, like Italy and Greece, it's the brutal economic reality of austerity and youth unemployment.
And in the North and West, it's identity anxiety, cultural backlash against immigration, and this pervasive feeling of democratic powerlessness.
And across all of these diverse landscapes, populists successfully wedged themselves into the gap between the rulers and the ruled.
That's a perfect summary.
So now that we have mapped out the soil, the economic and structural grievances, we have to confront a reality about human nature. People don't step into a voting booth and cast a ballot based on a dry academic analysis of technocratic overreach or macroeconomic indicators.
Oh, definitely not.
They vote with their guts. They vote based on deep primal human emotion. So why do these populist narratives resonate so deeply on a psychological level?
To understand the psychological engine, we have to look at the behavioral research from the International Center for Counterterrorism. Specifically, their work examining gender and right-wing populism.
Okay.
It reveals that populists are absolute masters at mobilizing emotions. We are talking about weaponizing fear, moral outrage, resentment, and a profound, aching desire for belonging in a world that feels like it's spinning out of control.
The ICCT report explicitly discusses an obsession with gender and sexuality within populist rhetoric. On the surface, that might seem really disconnected from, say, trade policy or EU integration. How does that fit into a political movement's core strategy?
Well, it fits perfectly into the narrative of status loss and defending the pure people. In times of rapid social change, right-wing populists conjure up the traditional heteronormative nuclear family as the foundational sacred model of social organization.
So it's an anchor.
Exactly. And they frame emancipatory movements like modern feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, or gender identity discussions not as natural civil rights progress, but as aggressive, unnatural projects orchestrated by the liberal elite.
Projects designed to destroy traditional culture and humiliate the working class.
Right. They're essentially saying to their base, the elites aren't just shipping your manufacturing jobs overseas, they are actively trying to destroy your family, your values, and everything you understand to be normal.
It is an incredibly powerful psychological hook. They blame the achievements of these social movements for their followers' feelings of deep insecurity.
And if a traditional working-class voter, particularly a male voter, feels they are losing their societal status or economic breadwinner role, the populist provides a very clear, tangible scapegoat.
Right, it's much easier to grasp.
Yes. It's not complex global supply chains causing your anxiety. It's the cosmopolitan secular elite pushing political correctness and gender ideology in your children's schools.
The genius, and really the danger of that strategy, is what it does to the voter's emotional state. The research calls this concept effective citizenship. Let's unpack that, because it's fascinating.
It really is. Effective citizenship essentially elevates certain negative emotions, specifically anger, resentment, and a deep sense of concern, into legitimate, even virtuous, political feelings.
It validates the voter's anger. It tells them, you are not bigoted or backwards for feeling anxious about a changing world. Your anger is righteous. Your anger proves you actually care about this nation.
I am angry, therefore I am a true patriot.
That is a psychological engine that can run forever.
Yeah.
But how do populists harness those emotions in real time? I'm looking at this concept from the research, the idea of populists operating as crisis entrepreneurs. What does that actually look like on a random Tuesday in a national parliament?
The concept of the crisis entrepreneur completely shifts how we understand their political strategy. Populists don't just sit back passively and react to crises when they naturally happen.
They actively create them.
Essentially, yes, they identify latent societal contradictions, fall lines in the culture or the economy, and intentionally push them toward a state of crisis. They strive to fuel a permanent crisis cycle.
Walk me through the mechanics of that cycle. How do you engineer a permanent crisis without just exhausting your own voters?
The researchers map it out in 4 distinct stages. Stage 1. The populist triggers the public emergence of a contradiction. For example, they might highlight a local zoning issue regarding a new migrant center, or maybe a new obscure EU directive on agricultural regulations.
Something that might normally just be a boring local news story.
Exactly. Then comes stage 2. They build massive public awareness, but they change the framing. They frame it not as a minor solvable policy disagreement, but as a catastrophic, systemic failure by the corrupt elite.
So the new migrant center isn't a housing logistical issue. It is a deliberate plot to replace the native population.
Which brings us to stage 3. This is the heavy intervention. They escalate the rhetoric to a fever pitch, pushing the contradiction into a full-blown perceived national emergency. They mobilize all that moral outrage and effective citizenship we just discussed. They demand immediate radical action.
And stage 4 is the resolution.
Stage 4 is the actual outbreak of the crisis and its eventual overcoming, usually through some form of messy democratic compromise. But here's the critical trick. Populists do not want the crisis permanently solved.
Because if it's solved, they lose their momentum.
Exactly. Once a state of emergency ends, the heightened emotions cool down and they lose their political momentum. So as soon as one issue is somewhat resolved or the public just gets bored, they immediately jump back to stage one with a completely new contradiction.
They pivot from immigration to vaccine mandates to school curriculums to agricultural emissions, just endless pivots.
They keep their base in a state of permanent mobilization.
Let's test that theory with a real-world anomaly, though, because it's easy to engineer a crisis over a new tax law or a zoning board. But what happens when a crisis hits that absolutely nobody engineered?
Like a natural disaster.
Right. What happens when a massive, uncontrollable natural shock hits the system, like the COVID-19 pandemic? Because you can't logically blame the origin of a novel coronavirus on the Brussels elite or a marginalized minority.
The findings on the pandemic are incredibly revealing. COVID-19 was initially terrible for populists across Europe because, as you noted, there was no political purpose behind the virus. It was a terrifying natural shock.
And in moments of true mortal peril, citizens who might have enjoyed fiery anti-establishment rhetoric during normal times suddenly demanded highly rational, science-based, competent governance to keep their families alive.
It was the ultimate stress test for a thin ideology.
Yeah, if your entire platform is burn down the corrupt institutions, what do you do when the public desperately needs those institutions to procure ventilators and organize mass vaccination logistics?
A fascinating, sharp split occurred based on whether the populist parties were in government, holding the reins of power, or in opposition, sitting on the sidelines.
Let's look at the populists who were in opposition when COVID hit parties like the National Rally in France or the League in Italy. How do they react?
Populists in opposition tried to run their standard crisis entrepreneur playbook, dramatization and politicization. They tried desperately to wedge the virus into their pre-existing cultural narratives.
Like blaming the EU for being slow and uncoordinated in securing masks.
Exactly. Some tried to blame migrants for bringing the virus across borders. They eventually pivoted to attacking lockdowns and vaccine mandates as tyrannical overreach by the deep state.
But did it work?
The data shows that during the intense early waves of the pandemic, this largely failed to gain them relevant public support. The public was focused on raw survival, not symbolic culture wars.
But the truly fascinating behavior came from the populists who were actually in power, right? The ones running the governments in places like Hungary, Poland, or the Czech Republic. How did they handle the stress test?
They completely shifted gears. It was wild. They attempted to instantly depoliticize their response. They suddenly started acting like sensible, boring, technocratic managers.
Really?
Yeah, Andrej Babiš, the populist prime minister of the Czech Republic at the time, literally compared running the national pandemic response to managing his past corporate businesses as a CEO.
So the fiery populist suddenly wants to be seen as a spreadsheet-reading middle manager. That is quite the pivot.
They relied heavily on scientific experts, parading chief medical officers in front of the cameras to justify their lockdowns and border closures. They were desperate to show the public that they possessed basic institutional competence.
Because they recognized a fundamental political truth. The permanent crisis rhetoric about cultural grievances doesn't work when actual bodies are piling up in hospital wards.
Exactly.
That COVID pivot reveals something fundamental about the nature of populism. We know exactly how they campaign. They are the outsiders, the rebels storming the gates, promising to tear down the corrupt system. But what actually happens when they win?
What happens when the outsiders storm the gates, sit on the throne, and realize they are now the ones holding the keys to the castle?
Yes. To understand the realities of populist power, we need to unpack what researchers call the paradox of incumbency.
The paradox of incumbency.
Break down the math on that for us.
When populist parties are in opposition, their electoral support is fueled almost entirely by voter dissatisfaction. The angrier voters are with how democracy is currently working, the more likely they are to cast a protest vote for a populist party.
Makes sense.
But the researchers found that the moment populists actually take command of the government institutions, the mathematical relationship completely flips.
Because they can't credibly run on dissatisfaction anymore. They're the ones in charge.
Exactly. They're the establishment now.
Mm-hmm.
Their sustained support suddenly becomes contingent upon voters feeling satisfied with how the new populist-run democracy is working.
They are suddenly held accountable for actual outcomes, like inflation rates, healthcare wait times, pothole repairs.
They have to prove that the machinery of the state is working well under their stewardship.
But that is a massive inherent trap. I mean, if your entire political brand, your entire identity is built on the narrative that the system is fundamentally broken and the elites are ruining your life, what do you do when you become the system?
Let's look at a concrete case study, because the research on Greece is wild. Let's talk about the rise and the reality of Syriza.
Right. Syriza provides the perfect textbook case study of this brutal collision between populist utopian promises and harsh institutional reality.
So Syriza was a left-wing populist coalition in Greece that surged from the political fringes to take absolute power in early 2015.
And this was right in the agonizing aftermath of the European sovereign debt crisis, which had utterly devastated the Greek economy.
To give the listener some context on just how bad it was, the Greek economy had shrunk by a quarter, unemployment was over 25%, youth unemployment was stratospheric.
And Syriza's platform was essentially a declaration of war against the people who were managing that crisis.
They campaigned fiercely and brilliantly against the bailout agreements and the strict policy conditionality imposed by what was known as the Troika. That's the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund.
Alexis Tsipras, the leader of Syriza, promised the Greek people they would literally tear up the austerity memorandums.
They promised to restore slashed pensions, rehire fired public workers, and regain national economic sovereignty from the international financial elites.
They rode that massive wave of anti-elite anger right into the prime minister's office. I remember they even held a dramatic national referendum where the Greek people overwhelmingly voted oxy-no to the bailout terms. It was the ultimate populist triumph.
But then comes the dramatic twist. The morning after the revolution,
What actually happened?
the U-turn happened. After a few months of incredibly tense, high-stakes negotiations in Brussels, where Greece came within inches of crashing completely out of the Eurozone and facing total economic collapse, the Syriza government hit a brick wall.
In the summer of 2015, they capitulated.
They signed a new third bailout agreement that contained the exact same type of punishing austerity measures, fiscal targets, and privatization reforms that they had spent years protesting in the streets against.
How does a political party survive that? How do you look your voters in the eye when you do the exact opposite of your core populist promise? What is the institutional why behind this massive capitulation?
We have to view this through the lens of external constraints. As the case study details, populists in power desperately seek absolute economic autonomy.
Because they need that autonomy to distribute state resources to their base, to fulfill their sweeping promises.
Exactly. But Greece was functionally bankrupt. The ATMs were literally running out of cash. Syriza needed massive funding just to keep the hospitals open and pay public salaries.
They desperately looked for alternative funding, right? Hoping maybe Russia or China would step in as a white knight to foot the bill and save them from the West.
But no one did.
They were trapped by the Troika's money. The math was undefeated.
To survive as a nation, they had to accept the conditionality. But to survive politically, to avoid being destroyed by their own outraged voters, they adopted a brilliant, albeit deeply cynical, strategy that political scientists call blame avoidance.
Blame avoidance, essentially saying, we are doing this terrible thing, but it's not our fault.
Exactly. They implemented the brutal austerity reforms, acting as the responsible, compliant elite managing the state apparatus. But rhetorically, they never stopped campaigning as outsiders.
They constantly aggressively told the Greek public, we are being blackmailed, we are being held hostage by financial terrorists.
We are forced into this by external bullies in Brussels and Frankfurt. By shifting the blame entirely to international institutions, they tried to maintain their anti-elite outsider credibility even while they were executing the elite's policies to the letter.
So the narrative becomes, we are the true representatives of the pure people, but the corrupt international elite has a gun to our head. It's a fascinating, twisted way to navigate the paradox of incumbency.
It really is.
Which naturally leads us to look outward. If domestic governance forces populists into these tight corners, how do they handle the ultimate constraint on national sovereignty? International alliances.
This is where we see some of the most profound tensions. If you are a populist whose entire ideology is based on the absolute unyielding sovereignty of the general will of the nation, then international institutions are your natural structural enemy.
And the European Union is the ultimate target.
The EU is the ultimate boogeyman for European populists, bar none. It represents the absolute pinnacle of technocratic supranational governance.
You have an unelected body in Brussels, the European Commission drafting laws and regulations that override domestic parliaments.
To a populist, it is the literal physical embodiment of the corrupt elite, ignoring the pure people. The Stanford University research on transatlantic turmoil outlines this very clearly. Nearly every populist party in Europe, whether they are left or right, is Eurosceptic to some degree.
They might not all want to completely leave the EU like Britain did, but they all want to strip it of its power. But here is a massive surprise for you, the listener. If populists hate international institutions, if they view the relinquishing of any sovereignty as the ultimate political sin, you would assume they absolutely despise NATO.
You would think so.
Because NATO requires a massive surrender of military sovereignty to an international command structure. But the Stanford data shows a completely different reality. A majority of EU populist parties actually support NATO membership. How does that make any logical sense?
It's a brilliant paradox, and the Stanford thesis breaks down the mechanics of it beautifully. We have to separate Euroscepticism from NATO support.
Why? Because of the fundamental nature of the institutions?
Yes. The EU is a regulatory political body that dictates domestic law. It regulates your agriculture, your trade, your migration quotas, even your environmental standards. It touches daily, local life in highly visible ways.
It tells you how to run your internal affairs.
Exactly. NATO, on the other hand, is a military alliance. It is intergovernmental, not supranational. NATO doesn't tell a country what its domestic law should be. It provides a hard security umbrella.
So it's a difference between someone coming into your house and telling you how to arrange your furniture versus someone standing guard outside your house to make sure it doesn't burn down.
That's exactly how they view it. And furthermore, the Stanford research uncovered a fascinating correlation. Populist attitudes toward NATO track incredibly closely with their attitudes toward the United States.
Let's unpack that correlation, because anti-Americanism has a long history in European politics.
It's a very direct relationship. If a populist party is generally pro-U.S., if they view American hegemony and military power favorably, they almost universally support NATO.
We see this heavily in Eastern Europe, right? With parties like Law and Justice in Poland.
Yes. They're deeply Eurosceptic, but they see the U.S. and NATO as the ultimate necessary safeguard of their national sovereignty against external threats.
On the flip side, if a populist party is anti-U.S., which is often the case with left-wing populists who view the U.S. as an imperialist, capitalist power, or certain far-right parties heavily aligned with Eastern authoritarianism, they vehemently oppose NATO.
Which brings up the elephant in the room that we cannot ignore, the Russia factor.
Right. We hear constantly in the media about Vladimir Putin's influence on European politics. How does Kremlin interference map onto this complex NATO dynamic?
Well, it is well documented that the Kremlin actively supports various far-right populist parties across Europe. The geopolitical goal is clear. Sow discord in the West, divide the European Union, and fundamentally weaken the liberal international order.
Russia provides favorable loans, amplified media coverage through state-run networks, and political backing to parties that parrot Kremlin talking points.
But wait, if these populists are taking Russian support, or at least ideologically aligning with Putin's brand of traditionalism, why do a majority of them still support NATO, an alliance literally designed to counter Russian aggression?
That's the million-dollar question.
It's because of what researchers call a strategy of pragmatic peace. Many of these populist parties are playing a highly calculated double game.
They will maintain friendly pro-Russian rhetoric, perhaps calling for the end of economic sanctions or praising Putin's strongman anti-woke leadership style to signal their anti-establishment credentials to their base.
But practically geopolitically, they know their voters, especially in regions that remember the Cold War, still deeply fear Russian military aggression. So they keep the protective, hard power umbrella of NATO firmly in place while playing rhetorical footsie with Moscow.
So what's the ultimate takeaway for the listener when trying to decipher populist foreign policy?
The essential takeaway is that there is no singular, unified populist foreign policy. It is deeply fractured. You cannot treat European populists as a homogeneous bloc on the global stage.
You have pro-U.S., pro-NATO populists in Poland. You have anti-U.S., anti-NATO populists in Greece. You have anti-EU but pro-NATO populists in Italy.
Their foreign policy is driven entirely by what specific thick ideology, be it nationalism, socialism, or historical regional fears, they have attached their thin populist vine to.
We have mapped a tremendous amount of terrain today. We see the historical roots of transition fatigue and economic austerity. We see the psychological, emotional engines of effective citizenship.
We see the messy realities of governing and capitulating to external forces. And we see the fractured, pragmatic approach to foreign policy.
But if we want to actually understand this phenomenon and not just dissect it from an ivory tower, we have to confront the hardest part of the research. We have to take their grievances seriously.
This is perhaps the most important analytical step of our entire deep dive, because it is incredibly easy, and frankly it has been intellectually lazy, for the mainstream political establishment to simply label all populist voters as ignorant, bad words, racist, or just chaotic troublemakers manipulated by Russian bots.
But our sources, particularly the deeply researched Friends of Europe report, explicitly warn against this caricature.
We have to take seriously the very real possibility that populism is not a sudden, inexplicable disease, but a symptom of genuine, profound democratic failure.
Populists exploit fears, absolutely. They use inflammatory rhetoric. But they also capitalize on genuine, undeniable hardships.
When a third of your population is impoverished by housing costs, when an entire generation of young people cannot secure stable employment to start families, when public services like healthcare are stressed to the breaking point by austerity.
And when rural communities watch their industries vanish while the capital city booms, those are not imagined grievances. Those are massive structural policy failures by the establishment.
And this leads to a critical, devastating observation from the sources. Mainstream politicians often use the threat of populism as an alibi.
The alibi of the establishment.
It functions as a massive collective defensive mechanism. Instead of the mainstream center-left or center-right looking in the mirror and acknowledging their long-term systemic policy failures, like the desperate need for radical tax reform, structural fixes to the broken housing market, or rethinking how globalization distributes wealth, they just point a trembling finger at the populists.
They tell the electorate, look at those dangerous authoritarian radicals. At least we aren't them. You must vote for us to save democracy.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for doing the hard, unpopular work of governing. We don't need to fix the agonizing housing crisis or figure out how to integrate migrants into the workforce. We just need to stop the bad guys from winning.
It allows mainstream governments to justify indefinite inaction on long overdue reforms. But the electoral data over the last decade shows this strategy is failing to convince voters.
Fear of the populist alternative is no longer enough to keep the establishment in power.
And when the establishment realizes that simply pointing fingers isn't working, they often fall into a secondary, even more dangerous strategic error, the trap of co-optation.
The trap of co-optation. The old political adage, if you can't beat 'em, sound like 'em.
We see this constantly now. A mainstream center-right party, terrified of losing voters to the far right, suddenly adopts highly nationalist, anti-immigrant talking points. Or a mainstream center-left party suddenly adopts fierce anti-trade protectionist rhetoric.
And the analysis shows this strategy almost universally fails. There are two distinct reasons why. First, it looks glaringly inauthentic to the voters.
Voters are smart. They can spot a copycat.
If a voter genuinely wants a radical nationalist policy or a closed border, they will vote for the original, authentic populist who has been saying it for 20 years, not the polished mainstream politician awkwardly wearing the populist's clothes for an election cycle.
And the second reason is even more structurally damaging, isn't it?
Far more damaging long-term. When mainstream parties adopt populist framing, they legitimize the populist worldview. They validate the underlying premise that immigrants are the core existential threat to the nation, or that the EU is an evil empire that must be fought.
Even if the mainstream party manages to win that specific election, they have permanently shifted the political center of gravity, the Overton window, toward the populists' home turf.
They might win the battle, but they decisively lose the war of ideas.
So, simply pointing fingers and yelling fascist doesn't work. Mimicking their rhetoric doesn't work. If mainstream co-optation fails, and if populist majoritarianism truly threatens the survival of pluralistic democracy, what are the actual solutions? Let's look at the paths forward and future scenarios.
Our sources present multiple scenarios, avoiding any simplistic silver bullets. But they all start with one deeply uncomfortable requirement for the political class: radical honesty.
Radical honesty.
Mainstream leaders must stop treating the electorate like children who need to be managed by technocrats, and start treating them like adults capable of understanding complex trade-offs.
What does radical honesty look like in practice on a campaign trail?
It means coming clean to the public about the sheer scale of the challenges ahead. It means politicians standing at a podium and admitting, yes, the rapid globalization in the last 30 years created massive wealth, but it left millions of you behind in deindustrialized towns.
Yes, our aging populations are going to completely bankrupt our pension and healthcare systems within a decade without radical changes.
Yes, Adapting our economy to survive climate change is going to require massive, painful investments. The establishment has to admit that the easy neoliberal consensus of the 1990s and 2000s is dead, and that structural, radical tax and welfare reforms are necessary to pay for the future.
It sounds like we are talking about fundamentally tearing up and rebuilding the social contract from scratch.
That is exactly what is required. You have to aggressively bridge the wealth gap. You have to address the very real, visceral anxieties around social cohesion and multiculturalism without resorting to cheap moralizing, where you just label concerned working-class voters as xenophobes.
You have to provide actual, material, security-stable housing, secure employment, reliable public services, so that the populist appeal to a nostalgic, mythic past loses its emotional potency.
And what about the international angle? Because we discussed at length how much these movements despise supranational governance and elite trade deals.
Right. The analysis points out a vital structural reform. We have to democratize foreign policy. For decades, foreign policy negotiating trade deals, deepening EU integration, expanding military alliances, has been an elite closed-door activity.
Diplomats and technocrats made the decisions in Brussels or Geneva, assuming the public either didn't care or simply couldn't understand the complexities.
But globalization has deeply intertwined the foreign and the domestic. A trade deal signed in Brussels regarding agricultural tariffs directly and immediately impacts the livelihood of a farmer in France or Poland.
Citizens are demanding a voice in how global interdependence affects their local lives. They don't want to just be informed of the deal after it's signed.
Yes. You can no longer manage international relations without intense, transparent public scrutiny. If mainstream politics doesn't find a way to democratically include ordinary citizens in these massive international decisions, populists will continue to easily exploit that democratic deficit, framing every single international agreement as a corrupt betrayal of the people.
We have gone on an incredible journey today.
We really have. We started by understanding populism not just as an insult, but as a thin ideology that requires a thick host wrapping itself around cultural nationalism on the right and socioeconomic socialism on the left.
We mapped its deep roots in the delayed transformational fatigue of post-communist Eastern Europe and the devastating economic and cultural shocks of the 2008 crash in the West.
We observed how it operates as a psychological engine, utilizing effective citizenship to validate anger, and how populists act as crisis entrepreneurs to keep their base in a state of permanent mobilization.
Unless a true natural crisis like COVID-19 forces them to drop the act and play the sensible manager.
We looked at the painful paradox of incumbency, using Greece's Syriza to show how populists who take power are often forced by undeniable external constraints to implement the very policies they campaigned against, resorting to blame avoidance to survive politically.
We explored their fractured, deeply pragmatic foreign policy, specifically the surprise support for NATO among parties that otherwise hate international institutions.
And finally, we looked at the failure of the mainstream establishment to offer genuine solutions, relying on lazy alibis and inauthentic co-optation instead of doing the hard work of rebuilding the social contract.
It is a profoundly complex, multi-causal phenomenon. There is no single villain and no single hero. But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over. A scenario to explore as you watch the news over the next few years.
I love a good hypothetical. Let's hear it.
Think about the core definition we established today. Populism fundamentally thrives on the perception that the establishment is corrupt and that the system is failing the pure people.
Right.
But as we noted at the very beginning of this deep dive, populists are now successfully winning elections. They are taking over the establishment across Europe. They are becoming the entrenched incumbents.
They're becoming the new elite. The rebels are occupying the palace.
Exactly. So what happens in 10 years? If populism becomes the permanent establishment and they inevitably fail to deliver the utopian nostalgic restoration they promised because of the complex realities of global governance, who becomes the new anti-elite,
Wow.
will the political pendulum swing in a completely new, unforeseen direction? Will we see a counter-revolution of radical centrists? A massive, angry grassroots movement of citizens taking to the streets, demanding boring, transparent, technocratic competence.
If the rebels become the empire, what does the new rebellion look like?
Keep an eye on your local elections. because this historical cycle is far from over.
That is a fascinating thought to leave on. The rebels becoming the empire and a fiery counter-revolution of the boring. Remember that broken clock we talked about at the top of the show? The political landscape isn't binary anymore. It is murky, it is complex, and it requires exactly this kind of rigorous analysis to navigate. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you hear in your own political landscapes, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are looking at something that has, basically rewired Europe. Back in 1998, only about 7% of Europe voted for populist parties.
Yeah, it was practically marginal back then.
Right. But today, that number has just exploded to 1 in 4. We are looking at a continent fundamentally restructuring itself. And my position here is that this massive shift is a direct indictment of mainstream economic governance. It's a severe material crisis, and it requires radical cross-border fiscal reform.
Well, and I contend that populism is actually more of an adaptable ideological framing. It capitalizes on a wide variety of societal shocks, both economic and cultural. So treating it purely as a cross-border economic problem is frankly insufficient and deeply flawed.
Look at the reality on the ground, though. You can think of populism almost like an autoimmune response. The body, meaning the electorate, is attacking its own democratic institutions because the traditional immune system—
The mainstream centrist parties?
Exactly. The centrist parties just utterly failed to fight off the infection of severe economic inequality. When you have a third of Europeans telling pollsters they are literally impoverished just by housing costs, and younger workers are facing this chronic job insecurity, you can't just wag your finger.
Right. Calling populists distasteful doesn't actually do anything.
No, it's just an alibi for doing nothing. We have to admit Europe's vulnerabilities and implement actual radical tax reforms.
Okay, but framing it as a purely economic infection just ignores how populism actually functions in the real world. Like if you look at political scientist Kazmad's classic definition, populism isn't an economic theory at all.
It relies heavily on economic grievances, though.
It leverages them, sure, but think of it not as a political party, but as a political operating system. You can install a left-wing app on it or a right-wing app, but the base code is always the exact same. It's the virtuous, ordinary people versus a nefarious, corrupt elite.
You're crediting their narrative as if it operates in a vacuum, but look at the underlying math. The billionaire fortunes that are just swelling through offshore tax havens?
Sure, the math is bad.
It's not a narrative invention. That's a mathematical fact. People simply wouldn't buy the corrupt elite base code if they weren't watching their own wages stagnate while, corporate profits soar. The ideological framing is merely the spark, but the wealth gap is the dry tinder.
I have to come at it from a different way, because the timeline of populist expansion actively contradicts that. If this were purely driven by economic scarcity, why was populism gaining serious ground in highly affluent, stable countries like Norway and Switzerland back in the late 1990s?
Well, that was the very beginning of the shift.
But that was well before the 2008 financial crash.
Because even in those countries, you already had the beginnings of neoliberal outsourcing. Globalization was starting to leave the working class behind.
But look at the most successful populist leaders today, right? Viktor Orban in Hungary, Matteo Salvini in Italy. They achieved massive electoral success by pivoting entirely to non-economic shocks.
You mean the refugee crisis?
Exactly. They weaponized the 2015 refugee crisis. Because populism is a shapeshifter. If there's a financial crash, it wears a left-wing economic mask, like Syriza in Greece. If there's a migration crisis, it wears a right-wing nationalist mask. The us versus them framing works regardless of the specific grievance.
Okay, but if anyone listening to this is thinking, well, isn't populism just xenophobia or nationalism in disguise? You really have to look at the economic data underlying those cultural flashpoints.
Cultural grievances are very real, though.
They are. But they are downstream of resource scarcity. When local public services are stretched incredibly thin, suddenly the us versus them narrative is very easy to sell. And this is exactly why we can't just talk about the narrative. It only works because the state literally has no money to fix the underlying problems.
So, okay, how exactly does standardizing taxes across Europe magically fix those local grievances?
It's about mechanism. Right now, European member states are competing in this race to the bottom for corporate tax rates. They got their own public services just to attract business.
Right. Corporate tax rivalry.
Yeah, so by enacting strict EU-level fiscal collaboration to close the loopholes that major corporations exploit, you suddenly fund local infrastructure. You directly remove the scarcity that populists weaponize.
That's a massive centralized undertaking, though.
We have to look down the barrel of the next 20 years. We have a tax-paying workforce of 220 million that's going to shrink by 50 million due to aging. To pay for elderly care, defense, climate change, governments need to boost tax receipts by 10 to 15%. You simply cannot do that without cross-border tax unity.
Honestly, the math of what you're proposing is a political suicide mission. You are identifying a solution that contains a fatal political paradox.
Wait, how is it a paradox?
Well, populism, by its very nature in Europe, relies heavily on Eurosceptic opposition to deeper EU integration. The core grievance is that national sovereignty is being surrendered to an out-of-touch, centralized elite in Brussels, right?
Sure, that's their standard line.
So if your solution is to push for massive, centralized EU-level tax collaboration, aren't you simply validating their central thesis? I mean, you're pouring gasoline on the exact fire you're trying to put out.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. It only looks like gasoline if you assume voters are completely irrational.
I wouldn't say irrational, just emotionally driven.
But branding Eurosceptic parties as unacceptable and running campaigns based on fear has been the mainstream default for 2 decades, and it hasn't worked at all.
That's fair. The disparagement strategy is a total bust.
Right. So if mainstream politicians finally just tell the truth, admitting we need radical tax measures to save our infrastructure, they win back public trust. You defeat the populist narrative by offering actual systemic solutions instead of just sterile political infighting.
Good luck selling that on a debate stage.
Think about it, though. If you show a rural voter in France that EU tax standardization directly funds their local hospital, the Euroscepticism loses its bite.
I understand the logic, I really do. But have you considered the actual electoral viability of campaigning a 10 to 15% tax hike? Let's look at the data on how populists actually win. You mentioned Greece earlier.
Yeah, Syriza.
Right, Syriza captured up to 36% of the vote specifically by campaigning against painful economic medicines and austerity. Populism thrives because it offers simple, emotionally resonant solutions.
But those solutions don't actually work in the long run.
That doesn't matter for winning an election. Asking mainstream parties to build a political mandate on deeply uncomfortable, highly complex tax overhauls, it fundamentally misunderstands how modern elections are won.
Well, we have to wrap up shortly, but my position remains that the demographic and financial math simply cannot be ignored. As long as incumbent governments ignore the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, and they fail to close systemic tax loopholes, populists are going to continue to harvest legitimate economic grievances.
Even if you fix the loopholes, the framework remains.
The root of the anger is material, so the solution must be structural.
And I maintain that the tripling of the populist vote share over 20 years proves its incredible ideological flexibility. It is a highly resilient political framework.
Resilient, yes.
Right. And even if mainstream governments manage to stabilize the fiscal conditions, populism will simply attach itself to new cultural crises. It's an enduring feature of our political landscape, not just a temporary bug caused by a tax loophole.
While we clearly disagree on the primary driver here, but I think we absolutely agree that the mainstream default position of just pointing at populists and disparaging them is a proven failure.
Oh, without a doubt. Fully grappling with this democratic shift requires untangling the incredibly complex relationship between structural economic decay and those powerful us versus them narratives that define modern politics. The source material offers exceptionally rich avenues for further investigation into both sides of that coin.
It really does. It leaves us with a critical question to consider. Are we going to fight this battle on the ground of material reform or in the theater of political narrative?
Or perhaps both.
Exactly. The surge of populism isn't just a temporary disruption. It has fundamentally rewired the political map of Europe. The question is whether we can fix the structural engine that powers it, or if we just have to learn how to live with the new operating system. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.